Hello, everyone, everywhere now here. I am with my friend, John Perretti, who I've known for probably 25 years now, maybe even a little bit more. And John's going to tell us a little bit about him, and we're going to talk about the mental obsession. He has been participating in the weekly discussion, and he has a long history on the planet, as though he's lived multiple lives in one body, which has taken the brunt of it all to some great degree. But we'll talk about that a little bit. John, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your history? And
Thank you, Jack. So I'm 66 years old, currently the oldest sheriff's deputy on patrol in the history of the USA. I am probably best known as a pugilist, an ex-pugilist. I helped to create mixed martial arts. I coined it. I also created grappling with the contenders. I was the co-executive producer of Extreme Fighting and worked for the UFC as color commentator, fighters liaison, and matchmaker. I was a college professor for 10 years at School of Visual Arts in New York City. I was basically a three-sport world-class athlete, spearfisherman, artist. I was a painter in New York City, and briefly in LA, and I am a memoirist, an author, and been writing poetry for 40 years.
so you've
As
done
my mother would say, he's lived 9 lives.
So you've done some stuff.
I've done some stuff, on a pretty high level. My son Enzo, my relative, is, I'm sorry, somebody's banging on my door, Jack. I apologize.
Sorry. So we had a little dog break in. So we cut the recording for a second, but we're back now. Go ahead, John.
But I live in Texas, so, break-ins are, precarious.
Yeah.
My son Enzo used to say all the time that my father knows a little bit about a bunch of things. So that's where it stands. Also, I'm a voracious reader.
Yeah. And you introduced me to, what's his name? Gordon Hancock?
Oh, Graham
Hancock, yes, whose show is now on Netflix about the what is it? Ancient catastrophes? Is it apocalypse?
I think that's the name of his show. Yeah, he's very well written. I mean, in fact, I just got a book yesterday. It's right here. 1 second. I'll run.
Well, and part of the introduction of Graham's work is to look at his basic. He's a journalist who has looked at the world and looked at the geography and looked at the archaeology and the anthropology and the history of humans and is challenging the basic precepts of modern day academic anthropology and human history in multiple different ways, just basically looking at monumental structures on the planet, or the remnants of them that are still there, that couldn't have been there or done by anyone else.
You see,
other than humans.
I just got America Before. So
Uh-huh.
it's the key to Earth's lost civilization in America. And it's, I don't know, it's 600 pages. I mean, he's so prolific. And really, he's a great writer. I mean, he's not Nabokov, but I mean, what he's doing is very, very important, because he's introducing us to, pre-civilization, pre-Ice Age civilization, pre-5 floods, and all that was left from before. So yeah, and again, I read 6-7 books every week. So information for me is everything.
And he's challenging the basic premise of modern archaeology, effectively.
And anthropology.
Yeah. Well, in human history,
and geology.
Yeah.
I mean, he has geologists on his side. There are geologists who have, decided to go to Egypt and look at the Sphinx and tell everybody that's not wind damage, that's water damage, and redate the Sphinx and the stone that the Sphinx is built on. I mean, it's like, talking to a Egyptologist and telling him that the Egyptians didn't build the pyramid. It's a very rough road, and he gets locked out of things. And he's the only thing he hasn't done where he gets a little cowardly is he doesn't talk about the whole earth covered with giants prior to the flood. He doesn't talk about how monuments have been picked up and moved that we can't move today. He doesn't talk about how things, giant things, got put together. He gets a little iffy on that, which is, I think it's sad. I wrote him a letter, actually.
Well, it sounds like he's at least conveying what he has the greatest assurance in, especially in the face of the opposition that he's gotten that seems to have completely written off anything he's doing. And as we discussed, it really is a sort of macrocosmic example of the same sort of reactive thinking that we each do when we're defending thoughts that aren't true and making believe that our defense of them proves that we're in control of a self or a life based on either that thought or all the other associated thoughts that we are defending in that reactive, fitful, fightful nature that we're constantly trying to demand our truth and our reality in the world as we see it, rather than recognize that the discordance and the conflict, the inner conflict, in my estimation, is an accurate assessment of a greater sense of knowing that we all have, that we don't bother to concede within the thoughts, especially when we're thinking about our thinking all the time, and thinking about our thinking because it's thinking about itself creates a self that is actually who we are, which means all we are is a mind, a brain, and a body, rather than any other spiritual component, any other natural electromagnetic spectrum component, even within the universe, would be pretty common as an elementary makeup to all life forms and all matter in every respect, whether it be an asteroid that's never even been thought of or a solar system that's never even been noticed. It would be the makeup of that too, regardless of where it is. And we share that with everything as our nature. So part of the insight that I saw when you gave this to me and I watched the show was the sort of quick dismissal by people in positions of intellect and in positions of credibility in terms of their academic stature, dismissing things without being much more inclined to defend the story as how it is and what they've done in terms of research than look at what he's suggesting honestly enough to be open to the possibility and suggest that if he's right, he's right. That sort of simplicity can open a brain to a lot of thoughts that it will not be open to if it continues to maintain the idea that all it's thinking is true and real, and now needs to fight for the life of those thoughts.
So I have a really good analogy for you. So about 20 years ago, when I was doing extreme fighting, I traveled all over the United States and was on like Geraldo and Sarah, Jesse, Raphael, and Donahue, and you name them, I was on them, wearing my little glasses and talking about mixed martial arts and talking about the hazards and the thisers and the thaters. And I debated the state's attorney general at the time. And he was this little guy, and he was very, very aggressive, and he was saying all these things that were terrible about my show and the sport that I created, and then he said something that was very, very illuminating. He said, "And they don't even have referees." And I looked at him and I waited, and then I said, "You haven't even watched the show, have you?" He goes, "I don't need to watch pornography to know what it is." And I've watched a lot of pornography, so I know what good pornography is and bad pornography. So that's what I told him. But I said, "You have the nerve to sit here and debate me on something you haven't even watched," which went on to be, the biggest sport in the world.
Yeah. Well, it seems as though every major transition comes with a major fight against that transition, which, in my estimation, is evidence that humans have been struggling with this addiction to a thought. And addiction is an isolated idea that my thinking is the only source of what there is in reality. Right or wrong, I'm going to, if it's right, I'm going to think it's wrong. And if it's wrong, I'm going to think it's right. And ending up feeling that the only thing I can do is to continue to do the thing that I keep doing, thinking that thinking is my only source, and all of a sudden wonder why I feel alone in the universe and disconnected and empty, and have this sense of hollowness, and feel like an imposter, and feel shy and embarrassed and not quite ready to step into any role I create, because I'm not seeing them as roles. I'm seeing them as life affirming realities, when in fact they're not. They're just choices. They're characteristics I've chosen and developed to utilize for the sake of making a choice to do something, not something I actually am, simply something I'm doing. And my sense is it has permeated and basically been referenced throughout human history in this exact form of denial that occurs. When rap was rap in the early days, the Grammys didn't have a qualification for it and didn't consider it music. Today, it's one of the single most recognized art forms within the Grammys, or if it isn't the single most, it's one of the major art forms recognized. Even those in charge, and I would say often those in charge, seem to be the last to come to terms with these transitions because of this close-knit relation we have to what we think is truth and reality, when in fact truth and reality does not need to be thought of to be.
Personally, I find that, I get lost. And when I'm lost in that kind of thought, I really don't have a sense of who I am. I'm always in some reactive role, whether that's a past situation that's replaying, or a future situation that hasn't played, or it's something that, could be happening down the block that I'm viewing. I'm lost. So I lose who I am because of the thoughts. Maybe everyone does that.
You're saying it exactly right, because to say you're lost is to actually feel the thought that has no basis. And the problem that comes up isn't to think thoughts, isn't to imagine things in thoughts. It's not to have illusions. It's not about not having characteristics that you like or personas that you like. It isn't about that. It's that when we think the thoughts are true and we think they're real, all of a sudden we think we're the creators of reality and truth. And to think that I am taking something I do that's a byproduct of my body and turning it into reality and truth has no basis. Absolutely none. So feeling lost would be an accurate assessment of the condition I'm creating in the thinking I'm doing. The feeling's actually giving me perspective and saying what's lost can't be found. You can look for it as long as you want, but you're never going to find it because there's nothing there to find. What you're looking at is a non-substantive. You've turned what you're considering in imagination into truth and reality. You've turned fantasy into reality. So you're looking accurately, and your assessment is, I'm lost. I can't find it. I don't know who I am. Yes, exactly. Because the preoccupation is thinking that who you are is in your thoughts, rather than seeing that all we're doing is thinking about our thoughts and concluding that they become who we are. That's a major misstep. It isn't because it's impossible. It's because we're absolutely capable of doing this. But to do it as though it's the only thing suggests to me that it's an addiction and triggers this whole sense of being incapable of doing anything else and becoming so baffled, because now the more we add to it, the more thinking we add to it, the more fuel we give it. And we start to cannibalize our actual bodily experience with stress and anxiety, which creates constrictions. Pressure creates constriction and also inflammation at the same time. And you know that from your physical injuries over the years, taking a beating the way that you have since you were a teenager, given your propensity to stand up and fight.
Well, that's because I don't run well. No, I have really bad turnout on my right foot, so running was not an option. Well, in fact, my high school my junior high school track teacher, with a, he had like this comb over from like Illinois, and he told me in junior high school that I was the worst athlete he had ever coached. Within 2 years of that, I started martial arts, and I was fighting in Madison Square Garden. So he was not a rocket scientist.
In early sobriety,
he also said, to his credit, he also said that this was 1972. He also said that, you remember 1972, right, Chad?
I certainly do.
So in 1972, he said within 2 years, the United States would convert to the metric system.
Right. I remember them trying.
Yeah, no. So, so sometimes, he gets things wrong.
Yeah. Well, Fred Smith, who created Federal Express as a term paper in college, business school, I believe it was, getting a master's or maybe a PhD. And he got a C on the paper. The professor said it'll never work. So the fact is, there's a certain resistance. What's interesting is that reactivity is certainly a potential we have. And again, it's not talking about what we shouldn't be doing. We're not talking about what we shouldn't be doing or should have done or could have done or would have done or wish we'd done or any of that. But simply looking at what we're doing, that we're doing it, is, to me, much more assuring, in my experience, much more assuring, because there isn't any question about what is happening. I could question it and take that step, but if I look at it and just simply concede that it's happening regardless of what I think, I'm starting to have a relationship with the exact same dynamics that exist throughout the entire universe and with this thing we call God or spirit or infinite or absolute or omnipotence or omniscience. We're starting to have that same relationship with that thing or that element or that condition or that essence, that presence, because I'm not reactively relying on consistently repeating the thoughts in a circular inner motion.
Well, I mean, I live in the most pious state in the United States. So I don't know, what, people believe. Belief is what is beloved of you. You choose your beliefs.
Yes.
So, but I don't have those beliefs. So my structure is a little bit different because a lot of people blame like red pointed ear, pointed tail things for doing things that are bad. I understand what bad people do because of my current occupation. People do bad things, but they blame it on, some evil icon that got off their right shoulder and into their right ear. So I have to be careful when I hear those things because if I say that I'm part of a bigger thing and I'm not trying to have an out of body experience, which I practice in the morning. As soon as my eyes open, I try to climb a little ladder and practice out of body work. I just have to be careful. And so like little lights go off as soon as you start mentioning, a greater power, so to speak.
And to your point about belief is basically a conviction or an opinion created in thought.
What is beloved of you?
So it's created in thought. It's something done in thought. Now, I would suggest that an absolute source, whatever it is, doesn't need belief or faith or trust or any of that because it is what it is, regardless of what we think. And I'm not suggesting belief has no place or trust has no place or faith has no place. But I'm simply saying that within the context of thinking, if we think of thinking trustworthy, our thinking will be affirmed and confirmed. And if we think of things, if we think of trusting things untrustworthy, that would be misguided thinking.
But do we think of thinking as trustworthy?
Well,
I mean, aren't we really
use it? No.
Well, wait a second. But before we put judgments on it, do we think of thinking as trustworthy?
I would suggest that if it is a part of our natural ability, that if it is used properly, it is a guidance system for our survival and ability to thrive.
Well,
and
we are called Homo sapiens sapiens, the knowing knower. Not only do we know something, but we know something.
Exactly.
But does that mean that all our thinking is trustworthy?
Well, if we think our thinking is that knowing, I would say that's exactly the addiction of making believe that looping in human brainwave thought is in fact and does become that other knowing of knowing that's absolute. And the fact is, I don't need to believe in that for that to be true and for that to be real. But when I begin to consider that there is a truth and reality beyond the thinking I thought was true and the thinking I thought was real, it aligns me with what's actually there rather than what I made believe was there. And if my belief is correct, then there's a confirmation. What is that confirmation? It becomes useful. And I know what to do.
I'm sorry. If I don't interrupt you, because because I got to use your words, and I had 16 concussions, and I'll lose those words. But how do we know our belief is correct?
No
Separate from the belief. So the separate
no
from the
conflict results. There's no inner conflict in the immediacy of the moment. There's no inner conflict, no emotional turmoil. There's no weight. And then the clarity of all the weight we're carrying becomes obvious. It starts to be seen as something we're doing rather than something being inflicted on us. We begin to see things clearly because we're looking through a lens that is unobstructed and isn't even a lens. It's just the purity of that absolute knowing.
But it's based on belief.
No.
So I believe that what I'm saying is true, and I have no conflict about it, but it's total bullshit.
Well, there is conflict, and you'll find it if you look. There's always
it's hypothetical. Right?
I get it.
I mean,
but you or anyone who applies that thought that right is wrong and wrong is right is going to find conflict because it's not applicable. It has no place in the nature has an order to it that when applied works, period. It just works. Why does it work? Because it's the natural order of things. It's how things are designed. And when we think thinking can usurp that in any way and become its concluder of reality and truth, we have made thinking the creator of reality and truth, which means all other thinking is wrong if it isn't ours. And that puts man against man and woman against woman and people against people. And it's pretty much a good description of human history.
But is it not a judgment on your part to say what is natural and what is not?
Well, I would say it's probably not natural to commit suicide. I would say that if we're given a body, the purpose of the body has a natural tendency of wanting to survive. And most organisms have that natural propensity to do everything they can to do what they can throughout nature. Few of them just say, you know what, I'm tired of this shit, and cancel the debt or the asset.
So I'm not asking your opinion if you don't want to give it, but so hypothetically, so do you not think that some human has a right to kill themselves?
I absolutely think they have a right to do that.
But it's unnatural.
Well, I would say if we are here for any purpose, I wouldn't think the purpose is to be gone as quickly as possible as a species. For whatever purpose it is, it would seem to me that support of one another and engagement with one another on a beneficial manner, in a beneficial cooperative manner, would be useful to the entire species. And if we eliminate ourselves in the midst of that and make believe that somehow the best we can do is just leave and not participate anymore, I would say there's some dysfunction in the thinking that's going on. Just a suggestion, maybe not. I mean, maybe we're like the lemmings who have been tasked with this nature of killing themselves, but in fact, that's not true either. Lemmings don't try to kill themselves.
That was a
complete
scam.
myth.
Well, it's not a myth. It was a scam directed by the DP who Walt Disney had working, and they started throwing these lemmings off the cliff. Lemmings don't jump off fucking cliffs.
Exactly.
DPs throw them off the cliffs.
So
that's how it happened.
Historically, it seems like as things interact, they develop, and very often, like in the universe, the black holes devour matter, but it seems to return it in a brand new form of radiation that becomes very essential to the nature of this ongoing flux that's going on around us. And we developed agriculture. That was a pretty big step in terms of recognizing the potential of the earth to provide basic needs.
Well, be careful, Jack. Be careful where you step, because the Sumer said, who developed agriculture, the Sumer said that they were taught how to do agriculture. They didn't know shit. And they were taught by the winged ones how to develop agriculture. That's how you have an Egyptian society that creates hieroglyphics in 12 minutes without any precursor to any kind of writing that developed it.
But
here it is.
Teaching, if they were taught, would suggest they learned, and there was some source.
Absolutely learned.
Some source they learned. Think of that. There's some source beyond their own understanding at some point, their own mental understanding, that gave them information that they quickly digested for the benefit of their society and put to work. And what
Absolutely.
have we done? What have we done with it through history? Contaminated it in the name of doing more cheaper to provide more for more. And what we've provided is food that actually kills people.
Yeah. So can I just back up for a second,
Sure.
though? I think the whole thing that we're talking about before we got into some Sumerian culture that I pushed us past, and I apologize for that. But
No, I
you know,
love it.
I got on my horse called tangent.
I haven't been to Samaria in weeks.
Yes. But before we start laughing at shit, because it can be very contagious, and and people can say, hardy har, that didn't happen, but it's written because it was the first written language, right? So it was written. So they were the last honest race. But be careful, because what I'm saying is that if we make judgments about what is natural and what is unnatural for a species to do, we don't really know what we were geared for.
I would say within thinking, you're absolutely right. But I would say within knowing, there is a knowing that knows and knows exactly what it knows, if there is a knowingness of knowing. And in the, intuition is the concept of knowledge beyond reason. And it means thinking and understanding are not included in that knowing. It's just a knowing we know. So for all of the winged angels and imaginary words that were used for that knowledge, it may well have been people just began to come to terms with things because they found things that work. They found a seed in the ground, planted, it started to develop something. I'm not suggesting how it was isn't how it was. I'm suggesting how it was is how it was, and the possibilities of how that was could go on and keep us embroiled and wondering forever. What I can be assured of is that whatever it did, when it did, led to what we are and how we are now. And if we have any benefit in any of the imagination we have about what they did, it would be applicable to what we can do now that might lead to a better, more holistic, more fully engulfed society that is serving one another, rather than picking each other apart with ideas that undermine and create tension and reactivity and doubt and all that other stuff. So it's going off of the limb a little bit to make the presumption that perhaps that's the better direction.
So what I believe contaminates this animal is that we were bred to fight with each other because we were very different, because we came from different places. So these thoughts, like religion, creates yet another way that people can disagree about things. Yes. And create war.
And consider that that's reality, and there is no other reality, and to think that there is an absolute reality that isn't contentious at all would be completely preposterous to that line of thinking, and seem absurd and illogical and irrational and insane to even consider it, when in fact it may be the insanity of continuing to consider that all there is a fight and a need to continue to do the things that seem to be necessary historically. But my question is, are they necessary now? And I would say no, not necessary at all. Can we pretend they are? Absolutely. Can we continue doing it? Yes. And I expect we probably will for at least a minute. But the question between us is, here now, right here, if everything that happened as it happened throughout the entirety of all history, and we now are in the presence of that culmination of everything that's ever happened, because whatever that dynamic was that interacted has led to this moment within the concept of time. And my question is, are we condemned to continue? Is it necessary that we continue to do what we think we're required to do based on all kinds of ideas we had about what happened and what condemns us? Or are we free to choose from a knowing sense, not a self, just a knowing sense that we all share, not one that I have that you don't have, but one that we all share? It's interesting when agriculture started, how quickly it caught on. There was some commonality in its ability to be able to transition, just like the number zero. We were talking earlier about the resistance. It took hundreds of years for the number zero to be included in mathematics before it was actually utilized and seen as something. It was seen as a threat. It was seen as, in European culture, it was seen as demonic because it could make numbers disappear. It was seen as black magic. So I wouldn't say that spirituality or an infinite source is religion. I would say religion is human's construction, just like the way we often think of God as a human. God gives and takes, and God is bigger than us. And people say God, he has more money than God, as though God has money. We refer to God in very human terms. We don't think of an infinite source as an infinite source. That would be absolutely impossible not to be absolutely sourced in. If it's true, if it is real, if it exists.
It's interesting how comfortable people are with, new religions, like Roman Catholicism, when things that were so much older pre-flood, got evaporated. And it's just, I find it interesting, as soon as I mentioned winged ones, which that's a quote from the Sumer, you use the words imaginatory. But when you speak about God, you don't use the word imaginatory.
No, I would say that's what imagination is able to do, is conceive of things well beyond what we think is physical, what we think is, our life form is not life. It's an expression of life. It's a form. It's a projection. Our brains, our bodies, it's something we have. Probably wouldn't call it the remains when people die if something didn't leave it, if something wasn't either housed in it or responsible for it.
Absolutely.
And the bigger question, John, is if all of those things, and I know that we can fracture off into all of the sort of contemplative abilities to watch how humans have fractured their own experience into all these other ways that they've invested themselves that seem to matter, as though matter isn't something that just simply obstructs light and takes up space. If we have that knowing now, where we are right now, right here, and it's here, then the conversation probably, if it were relied on, would not be steeped in history or culture or mythology or superstition or ideas that may or may not be true. It would simply be steeped in possibility, because it would be coming from a source that's absolutely always new, always possible, always endlessly available, and always present wherever we seem to be. It doesn't seem, my sense is here and now is not something a spirit is. Here and now is something humans experience with the body, since bodies are here and now. Bodies are witnessing it in the present. Bodies are sharing it in the present. Wherever we are, it seems to be when we look, whatever that is, whatever that source is, whatever that magnificence is, whatever that ability there is to come to terms with things where we say, I see it now. I see that clearly. It isn't because that thing that we did not see clearly was not there. It's because our thinking gave us an impression it was not there. And our thinking as something we do is a much different thing than our thinking as something we are. Because if it's who we are, it becomes real and true rather than a simple byproduct of reality and truth designed to express reality and truth rather than conclude it and create it.
So what happens for me
right now
is that the distraction of thinking gets in my way.
No, it's just there. It's just part of your experience. It really doesn't get in your way to the degree you think it needs to be gone to have this greater knowing sense. Keep in mind, in an infinite space, there's actually, you cannot have any matter in it at all. because there would be no place for anything. There is no place, there is no time and space in an infinite realm. And what occurred to me about 2 weeks ago as a result of our conversation, because everybody always talks about the dimensions, right? First dimension is a single point. It's actually 2 points. Second dimension is taking it to a third point. Third dimension is now 3-dimensional, where you have depth. Fourth dimension is time and space. The fact is, humans created those dimensions. They're actually not separate. They're intimately, absolutely available right now. And I had been talking about them for some time as these separate components, and that the fifth dimension begins to be this seamless, unified. Well, they're all simultaneous right now where we are. They aren't somewhere else because they have nowhere else to be. They can't be anywhere else but where we are because they have no place to start with. They can't come and go because they just are. They're a present state that's beyond the comprehension we typically use within our rational construction to consider the thoughts we use to try to make sense out of what's going on that often doesn't make sense, which is why when people say there's no common sense left, it's easy to realize that it hasn't been common for a long time.
So if you were to instruct the stick-to-itiveness of
what are you thinking of the stick-to-itiveness?
Like of the moment, like how to instruct the being here now.
Yes. Well, you are always where you are. We have always been where we are. We have always been present. There's no way not to be present and exist. This is the whole issue of insanity. If we think something that doesn't exist exists, there's a huge violation just in that concept that something that doesn't exist could exist. Because what exists right now as it exists, and it includes everything regardless of whether we're even capable of imagining it. It doesn't rely on our imagination. It doesn't rely on our thoughts. It doesn't rely on any limitation because it would include everything, and everything would also include nothing, meaning whatever we don't even think of, whatever we think is impossible would still be possible. But to think my thoughts all of a sudden become reality means I am condemning myself to fight reality and truth as though it can be fought. And that is an impossible war to wage, because reality and truth does not flinch. It does not hide. It is not shy, because it is what it is as it is, and doesn't have all of these other thought components attached to it, because it, as a knowing, doesn't think. It has nothing to think about because it knows everything.
And what about distraction?
It seems attractive. My sense is, John, because you're right on the button, and I can tell that you've literally been witnessing this and maybe not known what to do with it. And part of the discussion is about starting to talk about this openly, because my sense is people through history have been living in their own experience, thinking they're alone, because it seems preposterous to mention some of the far-flung, far-reaching awarenesses that occur to people that they can't make sense out of. And it would seem insane, and it has been insane through history when people talk about those things. They've been condemned to the stake and burned to death. Yes. They've been ostracized in societies. As a matter of fact, the book that I'm listening to right now by Bruce, trying to think, Grayson, his name's Dr. Grayson at University of Virginia, Near-Death Experience. Yeah. So he said that prior to 1972 or 1971, when a doctor he realized and met in his early research of near-death experiences had coined the name near-death experiences. And prior to that, historically, and think about this in relation to alcoholics and drug addicts, prior to that, historically, they had thought the people who talked about those things were insane. So people typically never talked about their experience. So the volume of information that was lost in the keeping of it to the selves of the individuals thinking they had this experience that was unique to them was the profound nature of an experience of awareness that we all share where we are right now and don't think is there because we stay in a comfort zone, seemingly defended for what we call security, but what we're doing is killing ourselves in the name of trying to be numb to what's actually happening and we're able to witness life in its rawest form and the most adventurous, colorful, absolutely fullness, well beyond emotion, well beyond thought, not even beyond it, but within it, without it, to just see thinking is something that a body does. I don't argue when I get in the car about the fact that the engine's running and how do I get over this engine running all the time? Because I don't make believe I'm the engine. But if I did and it kept running and I thought I had to drive the car, I would think I'm too busy thinking about the engine running.
So, but this is the problem with the experiencer. The experiencer is afraid to talk about what has happened to them. And sometimes there are thousands of people who see something.
Well, let's think of you and I right now in this conversation. Since if this premise, and again, it's a premise and it's a thesis and it's a thought, if it's true, that truth is true and reality is reality. And when it occurred to me and started to occur to me after reading Course in Miracles and Alan Watts and all kinds of philosophy, which is largely what I've read through my life, and then literature, and just starting to get a bird's eye view that was a little broader and starting to notice that the limits always seem to be the beginning of everything rather than the end of anything. And starting to recognize that if reality is real, it doesn't matter what I think, and starting to concede that if that's the case, that what I was doing in my thinking all of a sudden became clear because I was looking at it from a knowing nature rather than a thinking nature. And I can see the distinction now because I know now very quickly what I'm doing in thought is wrong when I'm feeling wrong and feeling conflicted and feeling turmoil. And if I let it build, I'm going to spill it and explode it on somebody else, thinking they're to blame rather than recognizing. The only reason I don't relieve it is because I'm not admitting I'm doing it. I'm thinking it's circumstances and consequences coming at me, happening to me, rather than being caused by me. Ultimately, no matter what happens, I make decisions in my own thinking about what happens that has nothing to do with what happens except as an interpretation of it, and much more to do with what I think about happens. So if my thinking is something I'm doing and I start noticing I have a knowing awareness, all of a sudden the thinking doesn't seem so monumental at all. It just, I see it as something I do. And yes, there are depths to it, or seemingly hidden depths that I create even that narrative to describe as though they're not here now and not available, because there is lingering doubt and denial and defense continuing to exist within my experience. It doesn't exist in reality or truth. It simply exists in the experience I've developed to make believe is who I am and what I am. It's not true. It's just what I do.
You made an analogy to people being spoken about as crazy if they talked about a near-death experience where they die on a table. Right. And they say they see white light and they go through a tunnel and so on and so forth, or they see everybody in the room in a projection, in a out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
And then they are told that they're insane because that couldn't have happened.
Yes.
And so, which has happened to me, by the way.
Just like Gordon Hancock. Same thing.
So it's exactly the same. So we see something, or something happens, and it's not palatable. Yes. by the knowing group that's out there, which has happened to me. therefore we have a tendency to repress talking about those things that have happened to us.
Yes. So think about that word, John. Repression is pressure. What's pressure?
And you
Stress.
and you can feel it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know it immediately. You know why? Our bodies are perfectly designed to register and monitor what's happening, and they're giving our body language is speaking to us, and we act as though it's a foreign country.
And I will tell you something else. As a fighter, I can smell it.
Absolutely.
No.
Dogs can too. Dogs
I
can
really,
too.
I can smell it.
Yes.
I also I can see things. It's an interesting topic, but I've spoken to other fighters who can also do it. But I can see things on someone in a sort of a glow.
Yes.
And as a target.
Yes.
And so if you are a person who tends to prioritize eye contact, as I do,
Yes.
as you know, then you see the nuances in others that show anxiety or fear or doubt or lying, or people lie to me for a living.
Yeah. Try to hide what they're up to.
No. I stopped at that stop sign. No, you're on video. No, I stopped. Yeah, you might think you stopped, but you didn't stop. You ran it at 40 miles an hour. No, I stopped. I see.
You mean as a police officer?
Yes.
Yeah.
They lie to me for a living.
Yeah.
Everybody is lying to me. That's why when I make traffic stops, I try to get 3 out of 5 traffic stops to leave laughing. No, that's my goal.
Yeah. So, John, in your comments, you're speaking to a knowing presence that's clearly beyond what is typically thought to exist. And if this knowing presence is a knowing presence, and it's indivisible and immutable and inviolable and absolute and present all the time, it is what we know, regardless of what we think. And so to constantly use more thinking to justify whether we're there or not is to constantly think we're not here now, and beginning to introduce thought. If we are those winged angels,
giants,
whatever the thing was, because the Mayans and all those cultures in South America saw a ship coming. Somebody came by ship to teach them about agriculture and all that stuff. It was
same guys,
but it was it was exactly the same. People who did not communicate saw the exact same image.
Same guys.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if that exists, and that knowing is ours now here, because it wouldn't be something that would be then and not now, and it can't be there and then and not now. So it must always be here, because there is no there and then in it at all. There is no past or future in it. And it's probably, we're always witnessing everything that's ever happened. And the idea that we can't see it or think about it is irrelevant, because we're already witnessing. It's kind of like, if I think I need to get somewhere, I already am. The conflict isn't that I can't get there, it's that I keep trying to claim that I'm not here. The getting there is the concession that there's nowhere to go, that it's always in the present, it's always where I am. And somebody in the group discussion, I think it was Richard, maybe a year ago, said that Blaise Pascal said, the great French philosopher who came up with I think, therefore I am, and I would suggest he was really aiming at I am, therefore I think, that one of the most difficult things for a human to do is sit quietly in a room by themselves, alone. There seems to be a distraction, a disturbance, something to do, somewhere to go, something to get, somewhere else other than there. And my suspicion is, if I have any keen awareness, not from being in the ring with people where the intensity pushes me there, but simply my own willingness to look at things clearly. My suspicion is if those things are there and I start simply conceding they're there and recognizing they're there, my thought is going to find them just as quickly or quicker than it finds all the stories I use to pretend they're not there, and develops. Now, the difference is if I develop stories that aren't true to justify and excuse what I'm not doing, that's unnatural, I need to constantly maintain those stories in my brain, which is what obsessive thinking is, because the only place they live is in my thinking. They don't have any other existence. There's no basis for it at all. And yet, if I apply accurately what's happening and align with nature, and it applies itself, just like 2 + 2 is 4 is always going to work in a math formula. It's always going to function. I don't need to have to go through the construction of what it took me to get to that point where I understood that 2 was 1 + 1 and another 2 was, and then figure out what addition. I don't have to go through that anymore. Probably never think of it at all. Simply apply it, simply apply it, simply apply it. Do I have to remember anything there? No. I automatically know. I know because my memory now is aligned with something that's greater than my thinking. While my thinking is so busy trying to create reality and truth, I'm forgetting things on a daily basis that I just did 20 minutes ago, like somebody's name or my keys or my car. Where did I park? All this other sort of stuff seems to be natural, but it isn't. It's actually a consequence of this complete preoccupation and misuse of our thinking as being the sole source of our existence.
And personally, I think that a lot of the angst is because this just from my experientials is because I tried to be, because I had this Goliath for a father who was incredibly violent and alcoholic and dead and charismatic. And I tried to become, the greatest fighter in the world. And if I couldn't do it in the format of as a kickboxer, not be the best, then I had to create a sport where I could be the best in the world. And even, 20 years past my prime, but the wear and tear on my synapses to be something that I was not, and to take myself away from the art that I've been drawing since I'm 2. That tore me up. And you have to understand that your hardwires get kind of frayed, and therefore you develop all kinds of things like palsy and stuttering. Actually, I'm not doing that too bad today. And you develop through a concussive history and also the desire to be a perfectionist, which is the most miserable thing to have to live with. My father was like, that's good enough. And he goes, no, not for you. You're a fucking perfectionist. And he'd say it with just like bile pouring out of his mouth. But to be a perfectionist is a killer.
Especially if you think it is going to perfect you as though you're not.
What do you mean?
If your essence is perfect because it doesn't change, and you think what you need to do now is force your human body into an expression of that perfection. You are choosing to be distinct from that absolute knowing that you have and create it all over on your own. It's exactly what those thoughts do. So the question, I would have this question, John. My sense is what we do, to your point about nature, what we do consequently, if a tree is planted and grows and has water and then has no water, the natural thing for it to do is die. If we have everything we need and don't utilize it well, we will die. We will actually succumb to that. That's natural. The question is, if we are doing within our own experience what's actually killing us, nature doesn't do that on its own. Trees don't tend to create toxic environments through their own will to undermine their ability. If the drought occurs, some outside influence that they share intimately with, if they don't have enough water, they're going to die. That's all it is. They don't argue. They don't fight. They don't stamp their feet. They're not upset. They just die. It just naturally fulfills the nature of a story. Life is like a story, beginning, middle, and end. In terms of life forms, life is always beginning. It's always new. It's always ever present. It doesn't end when our bodies end, and reality didn't begin when our thoughts started.
Except the perception, my perception,
Yes.
of the weak tree,
Yes.
in my household growing
Yes.
up
Yes.
would have died. That tree would not have lived under those circumstances unless I tried to change that tree into a strong, hard tree, which I really wasn't.
But just think about that.
And that's a fucking killer.
You chose to think of it as you did, as something you needed to fight and prove because you think what your father did, the choices you made about what he did gave you ideas about what you needed to do that were reactive to what he was doing. Because listen, when we're if we are adults and very, very frustrated when the limits of our thoughts, and I witness this with people all the time when I talk to them, my job and my conversations with people, especially one-on-one, is to ask them to look beyond the horizon of what they're thinking. And every time I get there with them, almost inevitably, they get extremely uncomfortable. They very often get an emergency call they need to take consistently, or they get angry and they start saying, well, you do that too, to me. And I said, yes, you're right. I absolutely resist at the edge of those thoughts. I have not gotten to a point where every thought I have, I see for what it is and no longer have a horizon to defend. So I absolutely do those things. But in talking about it in the present, if it weren't natural, healing wouldn't come fast. And I would say healing comes fast, except we're so unnatural about our thinking, disease seems to take forever. So I would say that's a distinction. It isn't to say that disease isn't natural when we impose unnatural things on us or things that oppose nature, because nature tends to thrive and want to survive. Nature doesn't just say, I've had enough of this and leave. We do. People say, I can't take it anymore. What are they saying they can't take? They're thinking. The perpetual focus, thinking someday if they focus more, harder and longer, it'll get better. And people eventually say, I can't do it. I can't take it. I don't know what to do. Why do they not know what to do? Because they think the only thing they know is what they think, rather than start to say, no. We all share an awareness well beyond that. We haven't, as a species, come to terms with this as far as I can see. This is like beginning to mention to all the sailors and all the shipbuilders and owners that the horizon is not the end of anything. And all of a sudden they realize they got a whole world out there.
Before you get into your Columbus fucking thing again, I totally concur on your synopsis of what I did. However, I'm still fucking doing it.
No kidding. That's the point right now, right here.
That's right.
That's the point. Okay, so if this were just something we saw as something we were doing, John, if you right now had driven the car over your foot you probably wouldn't debate about what to do, right?
Yes.
So my proposal, my suggestion that this is an addiction,
There's no debate.
it's starting to look at the fact that we think we don't even know what we're doing and still have ideas about thoughts and stories that we have in our own head as being real and true rather than simply thoughts. So what's interesting about the word dispel is that dispelling the ideas we have begin to take the stories apart and begin to help us see that we're doing the thing we claim the person did to cause us to be who we are today while we're continuing exactly as you just agreed and suggested.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, what would your question be?
How do I go about resolving this?
Well, think of the word resolving is something humans have looked for resolution forever and not noticed that resolution is a repetitive solution, which means the problem apparently has not been solved to have to be resolved over and over and over and over and over again.
That's correct.
Problem is my experience, we're looking from the effect at how to stop it rather than looking at the cause and why we started.
I'm well aware of the cause, and I'm well aware for my survival why I started it. In fact, you might say I took it further than anyone else.
But if you did and were, why would it be confounding to you now, since truth, in fact, does not have any condemnation or contempt in it, or any sense of loss, or any sense of frustration, or any sense of conflict?
Because it's habitual.
Well, but what is that? What's a habit?
It's practicing the wrong thing over and over again.
Yeah, it's an addiction.
Because there is a reward there that I'm uncomfortable with.
You know what it is?
Yeah, pain and suffering.
But you think you're in control, and what you control is pain and suffering. Congratulations.
I know. So
you were a wild success.
So you chase your tail.
Well, we create the
and
image.
Then you are exactly where you were, regardless of your articulation of the fact.
Yes. So even in the words we use, especially in the words we use, it reveals the thinking we're doing. And we create those narratives that we're chasing our tail. We see it, but we think about it as something that, like a dog, can't be done because we're chasing it, we're not going to get it. Well, if you continue to chase the wrong thing with the wrong thought, you're going to create more wrong. Garbage in, garbage out. Very simple computer science, right?
Yes.
And so my sense is, my experience is I began to realize that my knowing awareness was never dimmed, never blocked, never not available, never not here, even while I protested, like Shakespeare talked about. He talked about fools rushing in where angels fear to tread. Those fools are my thoughts. It's the foolish thoughts. What's the next group of thoughts I'm going to employ to start thinking about this in some way that keeps me thinking about it for another week or two, to think my only source is thinking, when in fact I just keep choosing and choosing and choosing what I'm doing. Now, part of what I began to realize some years back was that people in my relations with them were giving me perspective on what I was unwilling to see in my own experience.
How so?
Well, when they irritated me, I was seeing that I was being, I'll give you an example. Last night, I've been in the midst of this construction deal, and it's gone on forever, as you know, not just the house.
25 years.
Yes, but it's an art piece to me. So there's a part of it I justify and a part of it I suffer and struggle from. So some days I get morose. And Katie said last night, she said, I can tell you're getting better because you're starting to irritate me again.
Yeah.
But the point is that
it's very good.
When I see, and we both roar because she's got an incredible sense of humor and she helps burst my bubble. And when I see the irritations and I see the contempt and I see the ideas that I feel so clearly I understand about everything and everyone else, or anyone else and anything, I began to realize that this is almost like that knowing sense when I'm willing to admit it's there, revealing to me what I'm doing, not what they're doing. I think I'm seeing it out there, but I'm actually witnessing it through a lens that's absolutely initiated by my own projection, my own ideas, my own lens. I'm looking through Alice's looking glass and seeing the whole world only as I think it is.
That's right. And that's why I interrupted you. That is why I told you that if it could be 40, 50 feet away and I'm just viewing it and it's all wrong.
Well, in your thoughts.
It's right. It's a misinterpretation.
But here's what's interesting. When you think it's all wrong, you're actually admitting your thoughts are all wrong. And this is the difference. We've used everything and everyone else as an excuse, when in fact the excuses we've been using have been trying to excuse us from conceding we are the initiator of those things. So here's what's interesting. The discomfort of feeling wrong is thinking that I am wrong rather than something I am doing is wrong. Again, thinking thoughts are real. I all of a sudden become my thoughts. I become wrong. Something becomes chronically wrong with me. So what do? Create a chronic condition to justify it. This is manifestation in both directions.
That is absolutely right. You know, since you're not making coffee for me, I'm going to pour a cup for myself. Is that okay?
Sure. Can I have one?
No.
So in considering this and talking about it, I have written about it for 10 years now. I've probably written 2,000 plus pages. And basically, the writing has helped me to look at, with some perspective, when I fix my thoughts on paper, I give them a place to live for a second, and I can actually get feedback, just like I get from other people and other things and my experience all day long, my interactive experience with circumstance, and that we call circumstance and consequence and all that. And what happened is I did that more and more. I started to see that there was a very strong sense of clarity in what I knew was wrong. I could see in the writing that it was wrong. Something was there because it was complex. It wasn't simple. And it would boil down. And the conversation.
Sorry. And I do the same thing. Obviously, you know, it took me 7 years to write a memoir.
Yeah. Give everyone the name of it too, John, because it's got a lot of your history in there.
It's The Origin of a Species and the Mixed Martial Arts.
Yeah. So in seeing it more clearly, in beginning to concede that reality is reality no matter what I think, when I find the conflicts and I find the demoralization, there's nothing moral about lying to myself or lying within my thoughts. And I don't think I'm actually lying to myself. I think we've mistaken thinking for who we are for so long that we talk about it as thinking to ourselves and talking to ourselves and thinking about ourselves. We're not thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about our thinking. That's it. And when thinking thinks of itself, all of a sudden we've concluded that's the self. If my arm thought of itself, I wouldn't think I'm an arm. If my car could think of itself, I wouldn't think I'm the car. And yet with thinking, it seems to be something so uniquely qualified to imagine and conceive that the leap that's taken, that is the beginning of the addiction, is to imagine that reality and truth doesn't exist, which would mean there is no greater source. There is no greater power. There is nothing beyond the limits of my thinking. And what's interesting is the limits always define something finite, which always confirms what's infinite. Always. It wouldn't be finite if it didn't confirm something commensurate with it. And the infinite isn't something beyond them. It's something within and without them. It's a realm that's impossible to talk about. And I would say it's what the arts and poetry and literature have been created to do our best to express, because we know it, we want to share it, and we idolize people who are able to, when we in fact diminish our own capacity simply by not talking about it openly, presently with other people. Where we always are.
Didn't I just send you a text on poetry?
Did you, or could you?
Did I not just send you a text on poetry.
I don't remember.
It's because you don't read my text, probably.
No. Oh, yeah, the book. Yes, I saw it.
Did you read that?
This was coming from a book. I didn't see it as poetry.
I thought I sent you from a book on
Hamlet's Mile.
On Hamlet's Mill.
Mill.
Probably the best piece of nonfiction ever written. Hamlet's Mill, by these two individuals. One is an Italian, and the other one I don't know. But anyway, so I'm sorry, I rode away on my horse called tangent.
No.
But poetry intercepts life and eliminates all the extraneous stuff to illuminate just the facts, and also to give you a hook in your heart.
Essence. Well, it's realizing we don't need a hook to have an essential essence. There's no hook in it because it doesn't hold us up. It just is the freeing nature of an absolute state of being.
And I really think, and I think I said it at the end of my book, is that reading can be sometimes painful.
Yeah. So too is being when we're experiencing things in our human experience that are painful and disturbing. But when the thing we're experiencing so much is simply what we're doing to our own experience, we are missing the capacity of compassion and understanding and actually inclusion of others who are actually struggling in our midst. And
That's right.
Absolutely witnesses to the exact same conditions that we claim to want to get away from, and we end up in a form of conspiracy supporting their contention.
Yes, absolutely.
So if that state of being is our state of being and our natural state of being, then conceding to my thinking as though it's unique to me rather than something I'm sharing with everyone, that everybody knows what they know, is a very different thing to think when I approach people. And most of my experience, John, could be wrong on this, is that thinking has been seen as this major problem when it isn't thinking at all that's the problem. It's making believe that thinking is something other than what thinking is, making believe that it's true and real. As soon as I cross the threshold of thinking it's truth and reality, I think I become the maker of, my thoughts become the maker of reality and truth.
Well, one more time.
Thinking is not a problem. It's designed for our human experience. So when I'm thinking and think I shouldn't be thinking because I should only be witnessing the absolute state of being, I would never make a choice to do anything, including eat, if all I was doing was witnessing the ever-present state of being. I'm not here to avoid humanity. I'm here to engage with humanity and to express humanity. I'm here to express the fulfillment of that absolute knowing state. That does not mean I'm not going to have conflicted thoughts or ideas. It means that when I'm conflicted and feel something's wrong, I'm being told by my experience, my bodily sensation, how to guide myself to what's correct so that I can be more useful and more productive and more purposeful, have a greater purpose for others, not just me. The better I do for others, the better others are. If I bail water in a boat, everybody rises. Everybody. And if I sink that ship, everybody either drowns or has to survive on their own. My choices make a difference in terms of the differences that are made. But choices are not part of an absolute spirit. They're choices I make in a human experience. And I would suggest if we have a premise that's absolute and we act as though it isn't, that would be subjecting our human experience to the least of what we are, which would align with people feeling low self-esteem and less than and low self-confidence and self-abuse. I mean, think of the abuse that we subject ourselves to make believe that we're what we think, and then constantly think about that self. We're beating the hell out of it. We are traumatizing our experience in the name of thinking we're going to get something right someday. By doing it more is going to get better. It's like a father beating his kid harder and harder, thinking he's going to finally get the point across, as though the kid has nothing but that whip or lash or whatever he's using to know. That's insanity. We have turned against our own best interests.
Yeah, it's really common.
Common, yes, it's absolutely common. But now think of the source of that. A person doing that thing is thinking they need to do it to someone else because they're not thinking they're doing it to themselves. And this conversation, as far as I'm concerned, because if nature is nature, it should be natural to become natural in our actions when we realize what we're doing that's wrong, just like it is for kids when they I have a granddaughter who does exactly what I did when I was young. And if I tell her not to do something, she goes and does it right away to try to figure out why. Almost took her finger off in a rat trap. Missed it by a fraction. She put her hand on the stove immediately after I said, don't touch this, it's hot. She did not need to ever do that again to prove that there was something in what I said that might have been worth listening to. But it wasn't the words that got through to her. It was the experience. The immediacy of the experience told her, this is not a direction you want to go anymore. You do not want to touch fire. It hurts.
However, Jack, that's a very radical analogy. When something is lukewarm and you dissuade them, don't.
John, your voice, we're starting to lose your voice with the wind, and you may have to speak down into it a little bit. I know you're outside now.
It's a hurricane here all of a sudden. There you go. The thing is that your analogy is huge, right? I mean,
yeah,
and it works, but but if you use a lukewarm analogy and not a red hot stove analogy, does it work as well?
Well, yes, and if you don't use any analogy, it wouldn't work either. So the point of the analogy is just to say that when we decide to fight ourself and turn ourself into reality and truth and think we can fight reality and truth, that is creating an impossibility. Nobody, I believe, puts their hand into fire. Even the monks who lit themselves on fire during the Vietnam War to protest the war, while they sat passively and almost as though they were feeling nothing, were burned by the fire. Their bodies were turned to ash by the fire that they engulfed themselves in, subjecting themselves to that. And the point isn't so much that we can't do something else, but that learning is a choice. And willingness to actually notice what's happening accurately is the chance to begin to learn things accurately. And if we're not listening to what we're doing accurately, we're going to keep doing it thinking inaccurately. Someday, if we do more of it, it'll get better.
But if the end result of the choice is unlearned, as in dousing yourself with gasoline and disappearing,
right?
I don't see any learned part to that. What got learned?
The monks made a choice to make a point. They certainly made the point. They absolutely made the point.
I understand, but what got learned by that monk?
That he could do what he wanted.
He learned that?
Well, I think he expressed it. I don't know that he needed to learn it.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty easy to express things.
It's the same thing as suicide. It's the same thing as suicide.
Whoa. But the end result is there's no learning.
Well, the learning is that the best direction, I would say. Is that the best choice he had? Clearly, the idea of being able to make an impact on something as obscene as war, which seems to be common, people have tried to do and tried to speak to, and that's a pretty drastic step to try to draw the attention, but he drew the attention he was interested in drawing.
Oh, no, I don't debate that.
So my question, our conversation is, if where we are is where we are and all we know is what we know, and we are aware, we know, and we talk about things strictly and commonly only about what we think we know, aren't we asking for a sense of emptiness and a sense of continuation and a sense of repetition to justify why we'd even bother doing that, rather than allow those thoughts to begin following naturally, instinctively, literally instinctively and intuitively, a knowing source that would have us not even be asking questions, but just stating actuality, stating that things are happening as they're happening, looking at things saying, wow, it's all happening right now, rather than what's happening, what do I need to do, where do I need to go, how do I need to get there, when am I going to arrive, what should I do? Here I go thinking again, instead of meditating and feeling like I need to be in that state where I'm constantly aware of only that blissful state. I am aware of that blissful state, just thinking I'm thinking. When I start thinking I'm thinking and knowing I know, I start knowing I know regardless of what I'm thinking, and all of a sudden thinking does not seem to impose this dreadful state of obsessive compulsive behaviors.
So you think?
I do.
No. So you think that discussion is the vehicle to get us to understand what you're saying?
No. My sense is, as I was talking earlier, and you're bringing me back to a point I never made, but writing and reading are very interesting. Reading helped me clarify my thoughts. Writing helped me clarify my thoughts. Reading helps me understand other people's thoughts. Reading is something like this podcast. You can't listen if you're not interested. You're not going to listen. If you're not interested during this, you're going to hear you're going to be thinking about what you're thinking about and wandering off in other directions and not hear what's being said. And you can hear what's being said and think all you're hearing is what you're thinking is being said too. And those are options we have. And reading, interestingly, is a chance to commune with someone alone, where we're not with somebody else. We're turning what is written into our experience and often thinking about it in relation to our thinking, but there's no contest in it because we are willing to be doing it. You can't read without a willingness to read, and you can't comprehend without a willingness to comprehend. You can read. I find myself sometimes reading a paragraph and I have to reread it because I wandered. I've got a thought about the previous paragraph. Sometimes I need to put the book down after a paragraph or two and just say, wow, I'm going to contemplate that and live with that for a minute, rather than try to fill myself with more and more and more and more and more and more. My point in conversation is, to me, it's the most common form of communication that humans have designed and developed over history, something we tend to do and everyone capable does every day to some degree. Few people go a day or two without talking. And the other thing, John, is that our relationships are largely based on communication, interaction. And if we're interreacting, we're creating relationships to help us see what we're doing internally in terms of our reactiveness. We're using people. And what we tend to be is like we talked about earlier, irritated and upset with what they're saying, and that we think they're offensive, when we're not noticing that to be offended, we have to be defended. We have to be defensive to be offended. There's no such thing as being offended unless you're defensive. Because if you weren't defensive, you wouldn't notice it. Nor would I notice what irritates me in somebody else if I'm not doing that thing. Wouldn't occur to me any more than colors that don't exist within our light spectrum for our eyes to see can be seen by us. And to a quick point to your thing earlier, one of the guys in the near-death experiences described looking at plants and watching them radiate, vibrate with light. And you were talking about that in your experience with humans.
Yes, but I would just, I have to tell you that it's unless I'm taking notes, and now I got away from my desk because someone came in to my house, but unless I'm taking notes, it's very difficult to be able to interject with you, because you're an octopus of analogy, and it's very hard. But what I wanted to tell you is that a very brilliant, sensitive relative of yours once told me that people don't read anymore, John.
Right.
And it's true. I just went through the academy 3 years ago with 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds. And, they can do hundreds of things at one time, multitask on a level that I can't even fathom, but they don't read.
Yeah, and Jessica, who you're referring to, which is not inappropriate here, had read probably 200 or 300 books by the time she was 10. And I mean, sophisticated literature, and just always loved it. So part of the point about the communication, John, is that it's the most common thing we do. So my experience is that if you and I can have a conversation and start to pierce some of the veils that we keep, like, first of all, I will suggest to you, you do not need to understand any of this to know all of it. Understanding is not going to solve this. And we have relied so hungrily, voraciously, like cannibals, on trying to use and devour our experience and our thinking, that to think beyond it and start realizing that knowing awareness, we've always known it. We've always had a sense of it. We just haven't been considering it as our primary source. We've almost been thinking of it as something on our shoulder, or something behind us, or something somewhere else other than where we are, as though it's distinct from us rather than the absolute makeup of our entire nature, not just the thinking we're doing. The thoughts are a byproduct of a body that is doing, I don't know, you tell me, trillions of interactions right now that none of us are thinking about, but clearly know what to do to be doing what they're doing to give us the chance to even have the experience we're witnessing. So if that's the case, it won't take an undoing of what we've been doing, but a simple application, like you said earlier when you started to describe some of those knowing things that you know. The discussion, as it begins to engage around those things, allows the rest of that stuff to begin to dissipate, not because we can't pick up those thoughts again and have them, but because we don't need to chronically maintain them as a defense against something that is indefensible and that is not a threat. The threat is the thinking we're doing about things incorrectly. It's not the reality and truth that we're running from. It's the reality and truth we think we've created, where we think we're running from, like the dog trying to chase its tail. All the anxiety and stress is not coming from truth and reality. It's coming from the seeming truth and reality that we make believe is ours.
No arguments there.
So in that presence right now, as a poet, as a writer, as an artist, think of abstract art. Interesting that abstract art began to get developed right about the time the camera. Through history, people had tried to do figurative art. Nobody did abstract art. Nobody tried to make things look like they didn't look, right? Everybody tried to replicate nature in different ways, variety of ways, but the most precision was considered to be the best artists. Right? People who created images that looked like reality and truth, according to how things look, supposed reality and truth. But as soon as the camera came along, mid-1800s, and I forget when the initial salons in France started with Monet and all of the other original impressionists, the art started to fall apart and started to reveal a substance that was abstract compared to the rational construct of the literal figurative work done prior. And the whole movement started to take it apart because the camera now could actually replicate things exactly as they were. Not exactly, but as an image pretty close that would identify that space and that time and that place. And so it started to fall apart. So your work, I have one of your paintings in the house. Everybody is disturbed by that painting. And it has
rightfully so.
Exactly. It has to do with fallout from the nuclear explosion at Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And it's disturbing.
It's actually the firebombing of Tokyo, but
Tokyo.
the point is taken, because That's what we're talking about.
Yes. Thank you. Now, in that conversation, think within the program, which I'm going to mention the steps for a second, not to suggest either of us are affiliated, but simply out of context. We're asked to pause, restrain a pen and tongue. What happens when you really start wondering about something infinite and something absolute and something unlimited and something omnipotent and omniscient? Doesn't seem to generate a lot of conversation. Generally, the witness of that peaceful state of absolute being that does not change becomes pretty apparent. And as a guidance system, it makes the difference between making choices from peace or making choices from an already disturbed thinking nature. And what's going to come from the choices I make from the disturbed nature, but more disturbance? And what's going to come from peace? An infinitely greater chance of something productive, beneficial, bountiful, not scarce, not limited, not empty, not hollow, not posing, but actually substantive, with something we all share, something good for everybody in terms of being beneficial, if good could be qualified as that, or needs to be, which I'm not sure it does. I don't say it does, but good is typically something that works, something that creates the benefit we expected, not creates a pain we want to deny, not creates circumstances we want to pretend we had nothing to do with. And I would say in the writing of poetry, with Rumi and, all the great original, seemingly mystic poets, it's not mysticism to begin dealing with the actual reality of our existence. It's mysticism to think that the reality of our existence is what we think and only relative. That's the mysticism. The mysticism is the stories we tell, the cultures we've developed, the superstitions we promote. And in the face of that, we actually ignore what actually has happened through human history. So we can talk about it in defensive ways to limit the ideas and continue to construct ideas that aren't true to maintain the fallacy that we're in charge of history rather than simply see it as a story, a narrative. What happened happened as it happened. And right now we are witnessing the sum total of all that right now, always. That you can take to the bank, and you won't have a bank to take it to other than your mental bank, and start to give your experience a little more assurance that you do know something well beyond what you think. And simply to concede that begins to allow the thinking to say, oh, thank you. I'm off the hook. You've taken me off the hook you thought I was on. And I don't have that job anymore to perfect anything, because the nature of existence is perfect. The nature of an infinite source is absolute and perfect. It doesn't need my thinking to do anything. Now my thinking gets to begin to express, like the water running through a dam, that the dam never thinks about. It simply takes the advantage of its design and turns it into energy and power and provides and gives.
So you think the remembrance, if it is like the painting, negative. Wait, hang on a second, Chief. So do you think the remembrance of a historical ugly situation,
yes,
is negative?
No. I think when we think it's true, rather than just remembered and happening now, and it's not what happened, it's what we're doing with it now that's happening, and miss the fact that the impact of what we're doing now with it is what's impacting us and not what happened then. Because generally, if we can't play telephone and actually get the sentence right by 2 or 3 people from the person that started it, there's a pretty good chance we never remember anything other than the way we think it happened and not how it actually happened. So the impact of our thinking is what's happening in the present. If it's wrong, if we think it's real, if we think it's true.
But if the experience of, say, the painting,
yes,
right, is negative, instead of some la-di-da poetry, right?
Yes.
Where, flowers bloom and then they wilt. You know, I mean, we're not talking about Helen Frankenthaler here. You know, we're not talking about decorative stuff. We're talking about it's a very heavy painting. And do you think that because it's negative, we're doing something different?
I don't think I said it's negative. I said if it's happening,
I know.
if it's happening, it's happening now. If there's trauma, it's being perpetuated now. If there's pressure from it, it's being maintained now. If there's any continuity, it's being maintained by doing the same thing right now that you've been doing as long as you've been doing it and thinking somehow it'll get better by doing the thing that's worse.
I'm not talking about the painting of the painting. I'm talking about
your history with your father.
Okay.
If it's happening now as something you're doing that isn't what actually happened because that thing stopped happening how many years ago? It's what you're doing with it now that's causing the present traumatic stress that you're witnessing and suffering and are afraid to sit still with because you've been running from it thinking you can escape. And yet with these things in our brains, wherever we run, they go. They come with us. They do not hide and they do not leave. They just continue because we're resisting what we're doing. We create a persistence in the thing we claim to be trying to escape. That's exactly what addiction is. I'm going to drink more. I'm going to use more drugs. I'm going to put my life at risk to save my life.
And also I created the man who I became out of the horrors of my childhood.
Yes, you created a horror of trying to be perfect all the time, which you even said is just impossible. You created your own horror to go along with the fact that you love your father and you're intimately connected to him. He's the only man that's ever going to give you half of your body's DNA that you're living with. Your mother's the only woman you ever lived inside. And as kids, it's pretty hard to understand how that kind of feeling for somebody could be abused and overlooked and turned into an absolute hailstorm of punishment and abuse. There's no sense that can be made of that because it's insane. And if you were able to make sense of it then, you'd have been insane then. So to actually react in the way you did that was completely repulsive is an absolute, in my estimation, John, reflection that we know better that that's wrong, that is not natural, that is not what the best we can do, that something there is clearly violating the basic premise, tenet of life itself, truth and reality, the loving nature of an absolute source. We know it. And what do? Try to make sense of it. There's no sense that can be made of it. So what do? Create the exact horror in our own experience for a whole lifetime and think somehow we'll outrun it. And basically never face the pain, the sorrow, the mourning, the grief, the loss, and create those things over and over and over again to give ourselves perspective and not see that we're manifesting those circumstances in our life to give us a chance to finally concede what we're unwilling to do within ourselves. We think it's happening to us and we're alone. We are not alone. And it is not happening to us individually. It is happening to all of us to the degree that any of us maintain it.
Well, that's a thought.
Yes, that's a thought. So now a friend would tell you what's difficult to hear. A friend would not pat you on the back and tell you to keep going down that dark path and someday it'll get better. Just keep going. Everything will be fine. No, it has not gotten fine yet between humans. What's gotten fine are the points we make to continue to make the crazy decisions we make to subject each other to the peril and the horrors and the emotional turmoil that seems to be so natural, and it is not. It's just a choice. It's one direction we are able to go. And if I wanted to eat and sat in my head all day and thought about great meals and never ate and continued to nurse that thought, within a period of time, short period of time, I would starve to death. There is something I would suggest is unnatural about that kind of thinking, and it's exactly what we've done. Did you ever see the movie The Never-Ending Story?
Yes.
You remember the after all the travails, the teenage kid that the princess gets to save the universe, the last thing was the arch, that doorway standing in the middle of a desert.
Mhm.
And all it required was that someone look at themselves honestly. And around that door were the saddles and armor of all the strongest warriors and all the strongest men who knew they could walk through it and disappeared when they tried. And he walked through it because he was fragile and frail. He recognized his vulnerabilities. He knew that he was up against something and kept just believing that there was something greater at stake than his own limits. And he stepped right through it.
Mhm.
And I would say that these near-death experiences, which are interesting to me because it seems to be another part. Carl Jung described vital spiritual experience as a condition of what it takes for people to recover from alcoholism. And I think he was including drug addiction in that because there were definitely morphine and all kinds of drugs, laudanum and all kinds of things were being used back then that people were overdosing from, opium and mainly more morphine-based opiates at that time. Still today, it's not much different. But he talked about that vital experience. We almost need to get, our bottoms seem to need to get to a point where we're so close to death that we finally concede maybe this is the wrong path. Maybe there's another direction to go. Maybe I got a problem with the thing I've been doing to get me here and made believe I had nothing to do with it. And it's the thinking that got us to that point, not the drugs, not the alcohol, not all the symptoms, not all the things we use to say, well, I'm not doing that anymore, so I'm better. When in fact, the entire program of sobriety is about sane living, and emotional sanity does not include creating a new level of insanity to make believe delusionally that we're going to get better by maintaining an idea that is egoistic about who we think we are. So the opinions you had when you made those choices had to do with trying to develop a self of what you thought you would be or could be, not who you actually were. Because in that moment, when those things happened, you were always who you were, and that has never changed. And it is what you think about it, just in the way that circumstance is the thing we tend to think about that isn't thinking about the circumstance, but we're thinking about what we're thinking about the circumstance that we're struggling with. Circumstances are always just happening. And if you check this, and we're coming near to the schedule we set, if you check this during the points in time, you feel that I need to look, I need to find, just ask yourself if everything around you isn't happening as it's happening, exactly where you are, and start to check in with it in a way that has it that which is happening rather than what is happening, rather than ask it what it is and where it is and where it should. That's all coming from a brain full of doubtful thoughts. Just begin to concede that what's happening is happening and that it is happening now. And that is always assured. Anytime you are anywhere, if you look, and actually are willing to let the presence of that nature be obvious, even when it comes to physicality and mortality and all of the obvious things we're looking at. If you can begin to look at that stuff, that other knowing nature is all that stuff too. And to concede that what's happening is happening wherever we are is to concede that we too are happening with everything else, not apart from it, not alone from it, not in some other void or realm, but with all the realms, all the dimensions, everything that would make up life and the universe is ours, and everything beyond this universe, whatever that might be, doesn't need to be defined to be recognized as being what it is, and simply reduce it to something so painfully simple that the pain of all those other thoughts will become so obvious. I threw up multiple times. I had one instance where I threw up a gob of mucus that was acidic, that had to have been like the size of a water bottle, that had been in my stomach from all the anxiety and all the stress and all the acidic conditions I created in my body from the worry and the woe and this internal thing I thought I had to keep to myself and look like I wasn't doing. And when it left my body, all of a sudden, when those situations occurred, I didn't get drawn to my stomach and this gut feeling of something being so horrible. I all of a sudden began to say, oh, those are my choices. Those are things I'm doing. These are circumstances being caused as consequences of my own manifestation, of my own interaction, of my own thoughts. And it began to reveal the absolute responsibility, and I say absolute because it's not negotiable, of our existence, and also then make very clear the irresponsibility in the actions I was taking, in the thoughts I was choosing. And I began to see that thinking is a choice and thinking is an action. It's a primary action to every voluntary movement we ever make. So that's another thought.
Yes, sir.
And it's a contemplation. If we can be awake and contemplate and share with each other on that level, which I know we can, but when we do, the insight and the thing said, because it takes no effort to know, the thing said and the thoughts had will come so quickly and so easily and be so brilliant, because light expresses itself in brilliance and radiance and enlightenment. That's the nature of those words, speaking to this ability to express this natural light that is the source of life, I expect, within the universe. I don't know exactly out there, but all those near-death experiences, or a lot of those people, are witnessing a very bright light. Something white that's very attractive, so attractive that they can't look in any other direction. They're just fixated on it.
So again, you think that discussion is important.
I do.
Thank you.
I think it's one, it's interesting today that radio is still the number one form of communication around the world. For all the computers.
Separate this alien technology that we're talking on?
Well, I mean, there obviously telepathy, I would say, is a natural function of our. My experience is that everything we create, like the cell phone, is just basically mimicking. We're trying to take credit for our thinking being real and true, so we create things that mimic. The cell phones work on the basis of nature, on the electromagnetic spectrum, the microwaves, all of the different elements in the electromagnetic spectrum allow it to function. So it means that we have that function naturally, but dysfunction because of this preoccupation with thinking we're alone, thinking we're separate, thinking we have no greater source, thinking all that stuff basically disqualifies us from functioning on that basis. And my sense is we sense people. You talked about it. You could see the light. You could smell the fear. You could feel it. You can sense what's going on with other people. We know what's happening, and we deny it by making believe it's not. And all that's happening is what we think. And when all we're thinking is what we think is happening, we're beginning to think that what is happening isn't happening. And I would say that's a fairly major conflict for any productivity other than defective, like you described, hurtful, painful consequences to occur.
Yep.
I love you, Mr. Perretti. You have been a good man in my life, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate the challenges you posed in the discussion and the questions you asked. And to me, that's the engagement. Talk about engagement in your world. This can be an engagement over thoughts that encompass the entire world beyond the ring, and everybody wins. Everybody wins. Everybody gets to float in the boat. And I suspect we are living in a time when this is going to become a much more prevalent conversation, and has begun, where people are looking for something they haven't found and admitting the lack of finding it. Maybe they have been looking for the wrong thing because they've always had what they've been looking for. So that transition will help. The next thing I want to do with you, as you know, is have a conversation with you and David and I, and then I want to do 2 more of these with you, so that the transition and thinking that you do in relation to the thinking I'm doing can be seen as something that is flexible and developable and mobile and motion fluid, that's creating motion like emotion. It's moving. It's something that is dynamic and current. And the word current is interesting because it both suggests a flow and the present nature of existence. Current now and current flow. Current is moving. So my sense is the idea that we get stuck in thought is untrue, but it's a very convenient narrative to create to justify continuing to do the same thing over and over again and think we're stuck, when we actually are just simply stuck on doing the same thing over and over again, thinking somehow it'll get better. So
I understand. Yes, I would love to. That'd be
Okay.
great. And yeah, I look forward to getting into dialogue with the big man.
And I'll get this up later in the day, and we'll continue. Love you.
And
brother.
when you post this,
Yes.
you'll post my name so that if someone Googles me,
Yes.
it'll pop.
Yes.
That's
Definitely.
technology.
Yeah.
All right. You have
So
a
anyone
wonderful
out there
day.
can research John a little bit. John's got a lot of experience, so much so that I was always baffled to find out how many things every time we turned a corner, he seemed to have done something that was in need at some point in the history of our experience together. He had an enormous amount of experience in different things, including, I mean, running lunch to some of the most major artists in New York back in the heyday of the contemporary art movement back in the 60s, 70s, I guess. I mean, anyway, it's been fascinating to know you and to talk to you and to watch you grow and develop. And I am happy to include you in this discussion because as a warrior of sorts, you can put down the sword and begin to surrender and see that surrender is the ultimate win. Concession is the ultimate freedom and the ultimate recognition that there's never been anything to fight, but the thinking we're doing about what we're thinking is right and real that isn't. So, and that's all been a delusional fight anyhow. So we're going to continue this and I look forward. Love you.
Okie dokie. Take care. I love you.